Bitch by Jason Bradford, Chapter 14, Stealing the Dead. Sasquatch watched from a distance that would leave it undetectable from the figure cloaked in black. The sun was high and the forest was lit as brightly as possible, but Sasquatch knew how to go without being seen or heard. Its big brown hand rested on a birch tree as it focused on the human wearing black. Something tickled Sasquatch's hand. It looked down and a blue tarantula, larger than a normal-sized tarantula, was perched upon its hand. It was still for a moment, and then each leg worked in turn until the spider eventually traveled up the long timber-like arm, each step finding a bit of a tangle within the long, wiry hair of the 7-foot beast it found intriguing enough to explore. The blue tarantula found Sasquatch's right shoulder and stopped. It perched there, still and cozy. Sasquatch just stared at it, perplexed and shocked. It decided to leave it there. If it wandered its entire life to end up on the shoulder of one of the world's most elusive creatures, then so be it. The tarantula would stay for as long as it liked. The man dressed in black trekked on through the forest. Sasquatch had nearly forgotten about him. His face was covered by a mask that also hid the rest of his head. Black leather gloves hid his hands, leaving no flesh visible. His stride and form were the only masculine traits that suggested it was a man. Otherwise, there was no way of knowing who it was or what it looked like. There was a strange smell, but it was vague and too far away to be identified as anything other than out of the ordinary. The man continued, not aware he was being followed. Sasquatch stayed with the stranger, out of detection range, but always close. It was a little shocked and dismayed that the mystery man in black ended up where he did, the swamp, where not long ago her werewolf and the human sank a body shrouded in a blue tarp. The man waded out into the water. Slowly, the water rose higher and higher against the form of the human, as if devouring him. Eventually, he sank beneath the surface. There were no bubbles, no sign of struggle. The surface was smooth and shiny as a mirror. Cattails and reeds reflected upon it, as did the sky and the trees. The man was beneath the swamp surface for too long. No human could stay underwater that long. Sasquatch panicked. There was no fear of a human casualty. It was more of a fear that whoever it was wasn't human. There was still a smell of that unidentifiable odor, the telltale that death had not claimed whoever was gone beneath the surface all that time ago. Was this masked man in black a friend of Karen's? A magical being following up on a questionable deed that was perhaps misunderstood from just surface knowledge? Finally, nearly 10 minutes later, the man in black emerged. The soggy black mask still clung to his face, covering it entirely. But now, over his shoulder, as he walked out of the pond, the blue tarp that carried a human corpse dangled. The man kept on without hesitation or caution. On he went, through the forest, carrying death with him. Sasquatch did not follow. It looked back down to its shoulder. The blue tarantula was still there, apparently comfortable enough to fall asleep. Sasquatch thought of the rotting corpse in the blue tarp. Whoever was hidden within no longer belonged to the swamp. Whatever plans a man in black had for that dead body would remain a mystery. The sun would be setting soon, and Sasquatch knew it needed to return to the den to watch the pack of werewolves. She knew she would have to remain elusive for now, as her werewolf didn't seem to remember her. She would observe from the thickness of the trees and shadows and remain downwind. There was a sense of good in her werewolf. Still, after what they had done to the human and how they disposed of her corpse in the swamp, there was a lingering possibility that something happened. Her werewolf was acting out of desperation and doing bad things as a result. Near extinction was terrifying, and no one understood that more than Sasquatch, as she was also the last of her kind. The full moon was hanging loosely in the sky. The light found its way into the cave. Tyler and Bill sat against the wall of the east side of the cave, while Karen sat beside Jack on the west side. Jack was nervous about the imminent change. "Why am I so tired?" Jack asked. "It's your body's defense," Karen explained. "When you change, you sleep through it. It's not like in the movies where your bones shift and your flesh stretches while you writhe about in agony. Your body makes you sleep, so there is no pain. Your central nervous system disconnects, so there is no pain. When you wake up, You'll be like Tyler and Bill." She knew he was terrified, and all that she could do was hold him. She sat close, her arms cradling him as she watched his eyes get heavier. Jack could feel his body give in to the process. He recalled Tyler laying on his bed of gore the night he was changed, unconscious. Now, Jack would be in the same situation during his transformation. He held his hands out before him and stared at them hard. He was trying to remember them as human hands. He studied the shape of his fingernails, the lines on his knuckles, how they moved, the color of his skin. He looked at his palms and how his wrists were smooth. He committed these images to his memory so he'd never forget his human hands. He looked at Karen. He had never told her he loved her. He had been waiting for the right time, and even though the time had presented itself a few times over the past several weeks, he got too nervous or scared on each occasion and ended up not saying anything at all. Jack knew he'd never be able to speak any human language again. His chance to tell Karen he loved her would slip away and be gone forever. He had to tell her now. His heart leapt in his throat. He recalled the image of the anvil tearing through paper. It felt that way now. His eyes were so heavy. Jack knew he only had moments left as a human. "Karen," his words came hard as he succumbed to the change, his eyes closing. He fought the process. He had to tell her he loved her. She had to hear it. It was now, or it was never. Karen looked at him as he lay with all his weight, now leaning entirely into her small human frame and unable to sit up. His eyes were nearly completely closed. She knew his central nervous system was shutting down until the transformation was complete. Jack. Jack opened his lips, and his final thought of revealing his love for Karen danced foggily in his mind. Jack closed his eyes, and his body fell limp. He would never be human again, and his final thought that he had registered was that he had failed to tell her how much he loved her. Darkness claimed him as he sank into temporary oblivion. The final changes had begun. The cracking and shifting of Jack's bones echoed off the cave's stone walls, and Karen held him close as his body changed. She leaned into him, buried her mouth into his neck, and whispered, "I love you." Tyler and Bill left the cave, giving Karen and Jack total privacy during this intimate night. The following day was thunderous and explosive. Jack woke up in his new werewolf body. He was huge. He towered above Bill. His fur was jet black, and his eyes had faded from bright yellow to amber. He was lean, and his large, beastly limbs dripped in fur. Beneath his thick, shiny new fur, you could see his muscular definition. Everyone stood at the bonfire pit. Even Boris admired him from the safety of the dark shadows of the pine trees. "You look fantastic, Jack," Boris shouted. "He is quite the specimen, if I say so myself," Karen added as she approached Jack in his new beastly physique. She found him, ran her hands over his chest, and felt his fur's texture. The blast of his breath was intoxicating to her. She wrapped her arms around him and pressed her head against his chest. His heartbeat was strong and slow. Jack returned her embrace, and they held each other. "How do you feel?" Boris shouted from the shadowy pine boughs. Karen released her grip and looked up at his face again. The cut of his snout and powerful jaws were purebred quality. His razor-sharp teeth beamed bright, unstained from a first kill. Jack leapt from Karen and bolted into the forest, kicking leaves and debris in his wake. Tyler ran after him, howling in delight, kicking up more debris. Two friends, prone to running together, now shared the ultimate running experience. They were fast and powerful, and the world was theirs. Bill looked at Karen and cocked his head to the side. "Go on, go play," she said as she giggled at Bill's excitement. Bill was gone just as fast as the other two. He quickly caught up to them, and the three powerful werewolves ran fast, hard, and far. They growled and sniffed at each other. Jack buried his snout in Tyler's behind and repeated the greeting process again with Bill. Bill in turn sniffed Jack's new rear end, and they all familiarized themselves with the new form of the pack. The three werewolves ran down further than any of them had been and found a stream. They ran in it and splashed like three young boys. They drank from the current and hunted. They found, killed, and feasted upon a large 12-point buck. Jack had never felt so exhilarated or free before. He hadn't expected he would feel so powerful and untouchable. There was no sense of vulnerability, worries, fears, or limits holding him back. Being a werewolf was the best sensation he had ever felt. 2 months ago, he prayed for change. He had never expected it to come like this in his wildest hopes and dreams and land square center on his face. Jack howled. As wonderful as he felt, he couldn't imagine not sharing this new feeling with Karen. He howled at the others, and they headed back to the clearing where Karen was waiting. Several moments had passed, and Karen still sat on the fallen tree with her back to the cold bonfire pit, facing the direction that Jack and the others had run off. She was wearing her favorite blue blouse with jeans and black flats. The morning was glorious. She felt complete and at ease. The air filled her lungs with her deep inhalations, and she held it there for a few seconds before releasing it. And the day and all its promises brought a smile to her face. She closed her eyes and took in the moment. Karen, still smiling, opened her eyes. And before her was a vibrant forest with greens and golds mingled together. Sunlight poured through the tall trees and warmed her skin. She didn't hear the silent approach of Sasquatch, who was now standing directly behind her. Even the forest bed filled with dead leaves, twigs, and pine cones didn't alert Karen that she was no longer alone. Sasquatch smelled her werewolf in this human, and she was bewildered at how she was no longer in her lifelong lycanthropic state. The intrigue pulled her to Karen, and she could no longer sustain her urge to be near her. The human was alone at this moment, and there may be no other time like now to try and make this human version of her werewolf remember her place beside her and their years together as a family. A feeling of urgency was present, and its compulsion was strong to grab the human and carry her off. Once her werewolf human was alone with her, she would remember. Sasquatch was certain of that, but there could be no distractions. Do it now, she thought. Sasquatch reached out with her arms around an unexpecting Karen and lifted her off the fallen tree to carry her into the woods. Jack unexpectedly burst from the opposite side of the clearing and landed upon Sasquatch. His unexpected weight sent the monster reeling backward. Fur flew as Jack tore at her. He tried to bury his new powerful teeth into its neck, but the flesh was too thick and coarse to penetrate. Karen landed hard on the ground beside the fallen tree, and before she could react, Tyler scooped her up and ran off into the woods toward the den. She yelled at him to stop, but he didn't pay any attention to her request. His instinct was to protect the alpha at all costs. He dropped Karen in the cave and ran back toward the clearing where the beast was attacking the rest of the pack. He didn't pay any more attention to Karen yelling after him after he dropped her in the cave than when he was running with her toward it. Karen ran after him and toward Sasquatch to end the misunderstanding altogether and try to find a way to let Sasquatch know that she remembered. But her human legs, even though faster than a normal human, couldn't keep up with Tyler, and he disappeared into the distance. Bill exploded from the other side of the clearing and found himself upon Sasquatch as well. Claws flashed before Bill as he tried to bury his talons into the back of the gigantic predator. Sasquatch threw both werewolves off of her as if they were nothing more than small rag dogs, and stood tall. Its hulking figure was terrifying, and Jack's blood ran cold. Sasquatch took a step and looked down at her shoulder, realizing that her blue tarantula was gone. The hulking figure was thrown unexpectedly off balance when Bill and Jack lunged at it. She had misjudged the situation when she first thought Karen was alone. If this was her pack, and she did anything to hurt any of them, there would never be a chance of reconnecting with her. Sasquatch struggled to stand upright, her focus still on her spider friend. As she turned to flee, Tyler appeared from behind her and made the most aggressive attack on the distraught opponent as he could. He landed on her back and gave everything he had to try and penetrate her flesh with his talons. He tried to bury his teeth in the back of her neck as hard as he could. He could not break the surface no matter how hard he tried. Sasquatch spun around without success, trying to free itself of Tyler's attack. It caught footing and ran off, deep into the woods, disappearing in a flash. Tyler was still upon its back, snarling and biting as viciously as he could, and they both disappeared into the brightly lit forest. Boris flew down from the shadows of his pine tree and as quickly as he could, before the sunlight sent him into an episode of syncope, grabbed up the lost blue spider and carried it back up to his pine tree lair in a dizzying flitter of motion. By the time Karen made it back to the clearing, Tyler and the beast were gone. She stood between Bill and Jack, heaving, trying to catch her breath. She was more worried about Tyler than anything. Perhaps she should have told Jack what little she remembered when they were in the cafe after all. Perhaps she would tell them both right now. She had to. Deeper in the woods, well away from his pack, Tyler clung to the large predator with ape-like features and a flesh that was so far impenetrable. His arms and legs wrapped around its frame as tight as he could. The beast spun in dizzying circles, and the forest rushed before him in a sickening circle of blur and a disarrayed repetitive motion of out-of-focus objects. They stopped instantly, and Tyler felt a giant oak tree slam against his back and steal the air from him. A second hit against the tree, the sound of timber cracking from the impact. A third slam, and the tree cracked nearly thoroughly. Tyler could not catch his breath, and finally lost his grip. He hit the ground with a limp thud. He looked up and saw the monster silhouette looking down at him. The sun was directly above it, blocked by its large frame outlined by the golden morning rays. It was reaching for him as it heaved in anger. Tyler bolted as fast as he could before the large hand made contact and scurried up the broken oak that he had been slammed against just seconds before. He was surprised at how easy it was to find the branches and ascend the tree. Before he knew it, he was above Sasquatch, looking down at it. She was looking up at the black-coat werewolf with silver fur at his temple, and he was looking back at her. Before she knew it, he was getting closer, falling from the oak. His jaws were open, his claws were wide, and his canines dripped saliva as his eyes burned bright with rage. Tyler landed hard on Sasquatch. They were face to face when he made contact with its target. He bit her head with vice-like strength, and his largest bottom front tooth pierced her left eye. He clamped down and held on as tight as blood found its way to cover his chest. Sasquatch was spinning again, but this time it was more of a terrified defensive movement than an aggressive battle tactic. She screamed out in pain, the sound piercing Tyler's soul and chilling him. Birds left the treetops in fear and surprise. Deer darted past, trying to distance themselves from the beast that made that horrifying sound. She grabbed him with all her strength and finally was able to dislodge Tyler's powerful jaw from her face. She threw him hard, and he landed once again hard against the oak, sending it splintering into pieces before the entire tree above the point of impact was sent careening down in the direction opposite them. Tyler stood as he watched his attacker retreat into the forest, leaving him alone. He felt victorious and powerful. He heaved his large chest in triumph. His tail stood straight up to show his dominance over the situation. He felt he needed to finish this once and for all. Tyler ran after Sasquatch and was swallowed up by the thickness of the forest. That night the sun was hazy in its setting moments. Burnt orange, deep reds, and rich yellows transformed the sky. The sun itself blazed a blindingly bright gold. The insects and birds in the forest were singing their early evening songs. Bustling was evidence everywhere, as woodland creatures prepared for the change that the moon brought with it. An owl hooted in the distance. Deep in the woods, far beyond town, an old crumbling cabin stood in a forgotten part of the land. What was once a strong lumber structure with the promise of protection from elements, animals, and possible intruders was now a decaying reminder that everything succumbs to death, even wooden cabins. Behind the dry, dilapidated cabin, a tool shed still stood, which was in better condition than the cabin beside it. From within the tool shed, a soft sound, a raspy rustling that could barely be heard from the outside. A damp blue tarp lay inside the tool shed on a weathered workbench. It moved slightly, as if the contents wrapped and secured within were suddenly waking up and protesting its imprisonment. The lonely cabin in its tool shed stood bathed in the rich colors of the sunset. It was eerily silent. No animals or other inhabitants of the woods were scurrying about or calling out their exclusive songs. The only sound from the tall oaks around the cabin was the rusty hinges on the tool shed door. It squeaked open, hesitated, then slammed shut. The sudden sound clap didn't disturb any nearby animals or send any nesting birds from the penthouse treetop homes. Standing before the shed was Ginger. Her left eye was missing, and her sternum was split open, revealing the gore and the decay of her ribs and all the blackening organs beneath it. Her partially eaten, decaying heart beat, a slow rhythm, bump, bump, bump. It started to get faster, until it sang its eerie song of illogical life-from-death lyrics. Bump, 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 bump. Ginger gazed blankly from her one milky eye. Her hair, even matted and muddy, reflected the majestic autumn colors of the sunset and blazed like a hellish wildfire upon her head and shoulders. The blinding crimson fire trailed behind her as she disappeared into the thick woods, where the darkening and menacing shadows consumed her. The undead Ginger carried onward, as the one who had brought her back from the dead ordered her to do so. She continued far across the forest toward the 6-year-old little boy named Dylan, and tonight, That small child would know monsters are real. David, a man in his early 20s, panicked slightly. The sun was nearly set, and darkness was fast behind him. He was in a strange land with the phone's GPS that refused to work. He trudged forward, trying not to let his fear cloud his mind. David was athletic and slender, a fit hiker and thrill-seeker. He kept going through his current situation in his head. His friends and family all lived in California, where he had traveled from, and he hadn't told anyone he was stopping here on his way to the East Coast. His craving for a serving of adventure took over, and before he knew it, he had parked his SUV, grabbed a small backpack, and had a full serving of regret instead of adventure. How had he not told anyone where he would be? He cursed himself at the annoyance of his stupidity. David more than understood that safety was always first without fail, yet here he was, lost in a forest, far from any known civilization, with darkness setting faster than he had ever witnessed before, and he was lost. The flashlight beam bounced and danced before him and flickered with the threat of adding severity to the already alarming situation. He tried to maintain composure and keep from hyperventilating. Surely his SUV was in this direction. He hadn't been on the trail for more than an hour and a half. Another flicker of darkness from the flashlight. David hit the flashlight against his palm of his left hand, and it continued to protest, offering light. Snap! Crunch! The dark flashlight flew from David's grip and spiraled into the dense brush beside him. David also spiraled to the ground. His foot burned and throbbed. The last of the waning light from the sun made what had happened barely visible, but there it was. A large bear trap had snared his foot just above his ankle. The skin was torn, and layers of flesh, tendon, and muscle protruded from the side, where blood spilled as if from a grotesque faucet made of the torn flesh. David screamed. He pulled against the trap, but the rusty jaws of the iron prison refused to give way. His foot flopped about like a fish out of water. He knew his tibia and fibula had both been severed. His foot remained intact, with just a small amount of muscle and tissue. Still, in a panic, David flailed about and strained against it, not believing what had happened. Adrenaline and shock caused his arms to quiver. His hand shook violently as he reached for his cell phone from his right pocket. It was no good. He was shaking too severely to hold the phone still long enough for the facial recognition feature to unlock the small cell. In urgency, he continued to try to unlock the phone. Finally, the phone opened from the lock screen to the home screen, but his hands trembled too much to find coordination. A loud crack of something heavy breaking a fallen branch alerted him that he was not alone. David was afraid a bear or some other dangerous animal had sensed his fear and decided to take advantage of the situation and indulge in a free all-you-can-eat dinner. He closed his eyes as he pulled at the chain that was locked around the base of a thick oak. Beside him was a man, appearing from the shadows where the sound had come from. "Oh, thank God. This fucking trap," David shouted. "Help me, please," he pleaded. The man was dressed in all black, and his face was hidden behind a black fabric mask. No trace of identifiable normalcy was evident. The man said nothing to David. His right arm was hidden out of sight behind his back. David was made uneasy about the man's dark presence. Something was off. The black-clad man shifted his right arm, bringing it into sight, revealing a large felling axe within his grip. He gripped it in both hands and raised it over his head. The lost hiker raised his hands in shock and panic, an instant involuntary reaction to the threat of the shiny, sharp axe blade. "No, no, no, no," was all that would escape David's lips. The axe blade swung downward hard, and with a wet, sickening crunch found its way into the palm of its trapped victim. It sliced through the fleshy palm and continued to sever between David's radius and ulna. His arm fell apart in two different directions, and from the elbow hung grotesquely two parts of his mutilated arm. Splattered blood and his screams were the only things David was aware of. The blade raised again and came down a second time, harder than before. It wedged deep, shattering his clavicle before sinking into his neck. David's reality spiraled as he sank into darkness. He could hear his body hit the ground under him when he fell back, but he never felt it. The last image to register in his fading consciousness was the third blow of the axe. The man in black brought the axe down again and again. It was more work removing a head from a man's shoulders than he had imagined. But after 3 or 4 blows with the sharp blade, the head indeed was removed, perhaps not cleanly, but well enough. It rolled away from the body, the last strike releasing a popping sound and a torrent of blood that soaked the earth beneath the young victim. The axe found its way down again, chopping through the already damaged ankle. The extremity was severed in just one blow. The foot and the body were rolled down a nearby ravine. The head was carried by the jagged cervical spine that was partially still intact and protruded from the bottom of the head. David's upside-down expression of terror was frozen as his head was carried away, swinging back and forth as the man in black walked on towards his victim's parked SUV.